Oh, there are plenty of other firsts that this year's inauguration will bring.
And joining us live to talk about some of them is Professor of Political Science at Portland State University, Dr. Jack Miller. Good morning. Good to see you.
Morning. Thanks for having me on.
So how does this inauguration differ from prior ceremonies that we've seen? Things are looking very different this year.
Well, of course, the visual of it is going to be very different. We're not going to have a big crowd. There's going to be this massive security presence. But one of the things that makes this different than any inauguration in our lifetimes is how transformative this change of administration is going to be. And whenever we have a new president from a different party of the previous president, there's always going to be big changes in terms of policy and orientation. But in this particular case, we have the least experienced president giving way to one of the most experienced presidents we've ever had in our lifetimes. The last president with this much experience in the federal government was George Herbert Walker Bush, who was inaugurated in 1989. And the previous president with the most experience in the Senate was Lyndon Johnson all the way back to the 1960s. So we're seeing a level of experience coming into the presidency that is not typical in the United States.
Okay, and so yeah, we are expecting a lot of change. How do you think people in Portland, particularly protesters, will respond today?
The thing is that we have protesters from both sides of the political spectrum, and there are people who are not necessarily protesting but celebrating the incoming administration, and then people who are protesting what some consider to be still a stolen election, and then there are just other people who are dissatisfied. Pretty much every time I've seen a new president come in, there's people walking around with "Not My President" T-shirts, whoever it happens to be, George Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, that there's always a sense among some small group of people that, well, I didn't vote for this person and they're not my president. So this is I shouldn't say a little, it's a lot more intense with the Stop the Steal movement, people who are actually denying the reality of this election. But there is a pretty common thread among protesters and demonstrators at any inauguration that some people are extremely pleased and some people reject the legitimacy of the new administration entirely.
So earlier this morning, we saw the outgoing president, President Trump, wishing good luck to the new administration, acknowledging that there is a new administration coming in before departing to Florida. We know he's not going to be in attendance for the actual inauguration ceremony. How does that affect things?
Well, all that really does is it just reminds what is left of the hardcore supporters of Donald Trump that he could barely have the good enough grace to wish the incoming administration luck, but he is going to be doing everything he can to undermine the next administration. Most outgoing presidents go not just with congratulations to the new president, but kind of quietly into the background to let the new administration have their time at the center stage. Donald Trump is probably not going to do that. He's going to try everything he can to stay center stage, and that is going to complicate things. But the big difference now is that Joe Biden, as of noon Eastern this afternoon, he'll be the president of the United States, and that is a huge spotlight that is moving from one person to another. So whatever Donald Trump does to try to stay in the spotlight, he doesn't have that giant spotlight anymore. Joe Biden does. And that will make a tremendous difference for the country.
Yeah, in his Trump speech this morning, he ended it with, "We'll see you soon." So yeah, it does make you wonder what his next plan is. How will the riot that happened on the 6th of January change President Trump's legacy?
Well, I think it's not only has it become his legacy, there are a lot of people who were allies of Trump for a really long time who said this is going to be the defining feature of his legacy. Whatever else he might have done, and he didn't do a tremendous amount legislatively, he did a lot through executive action, but whatever else he might have done that people, conservatives like, is eclipsed by his incitement of this insurrection. And so he will have to live with that, and the Republican Party is living with an even more fierce internal civil war than it was going to have to face anyway. An outgoing president is always going to kick off a kind of an internal power struggle in the party that's leaving the White House. In this case, the stakes are even higher, and the number of people who are leaving or who are dropping their support for not only Donald Trump, but the Republicans in Congress who voted to sustain the objections to the Electoral College is going to change the political calculus for a lot of Republicans. They're not even sure exactly what that is going to do. A lot of corporate donors are withdrawing their money from political action committees supporting Republicans. We'll have to wait really until the 2022 midterm elections to know what kind of political impact that's going to have. But we're going to watch over the next several weeks, especially as the impeachment trial in the Senate kicks off, whenever that is. We're going to see the Republican Party trying to navigate this new landscape with a really uncertain political calculation as to what the insurrection will do for their base of supporters.
Yeah, Dr. Miller, you mentioned the impeachment trial. That is one thing on the Senate's plate. We know they also have to confirm the rest of President-elect Joe Biden's cabinet. And a lot of people tend to focus on what the president is able to accomplish in the first 100 days of a new administration. So what needs to happen here to really get the ball rolling on some action on several items?
Well, the beginning of any new administration is just an onslaught of legislative business. Confirming the cabinet is definitely a big one for any administration, and that's going to be no less or more difficult this time than it ever is. The fact that Joe Biden is taking office amid a pandemic and a recession and the threats of civil violence around the country means that there's going to be a level of intensity that we haven't seen before. I suspect that incoming Majority Leader Chuck Schumer is going to have the Senate working long hours, and that there's going to be a lot of negotiating and bill writing in these first 100 days that even more strongly, this is more reminiscent of the first 100 days of Franklin Roosevelt, which is where the term comes from. He said in the first 100 days, I'm going to do these things. Every president ever since has kind of dubbed their first 100 days. What's going to come out of Congress is we have unified control. The Democrats control both the House and the Senate, which means that there's going to be more done more quickly. But it's a narrow majority in both houses. And so it's kind of unpredictable as to how powerful the agenda is going to be. How big is the stimulus bill going to be? What are going to be the regulations that are going to come out to transform the U.S. stance on climate change and on immigration? Those are big questions, but there's going to be a lot of hours spent in the congressional chambers trying to get these things through.
Yeah, well, they do have a lot of work to do, all while that impeachment trial is going on in the Senate. Dr. Jack Miller, PSU political science professor, thanks for your time this morning and for joining us with your insight.
Thanks for having me on.